Okay, we're back, and it's COMP2068, Advanced Web Programming, and it's Week 7, Lesson 7, Part 1. And we just finished, most of us just finished our exam. It was the dice roller exam that we were doing, right? And again, I kind of call this the hello world for game programmers, right? If you can do a dice roller, it's a good example of being some basic game. It's you need to know how to do random generation for any game you make, and positioning things with Create.js. It's a good way of doing things. Practicing like this in a time constraint pushes you to look at the API documentation and understand things. After this, the things we do should be easier. In fact, if anything, with the exam, I'm training you to do the next piece, which is your more difficult assignments coming up. Tom, where are you going? Are you going to do your exam? Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll continue recording. All right, so let's go to the next piece. What I want to do is I want to go over that last thing we worked on, which was the boilerplate that I worked on or the demo that I did for the slot machine. Most of you have got it done, but there's some technologies I want to talk about that I didn't have a chance to get around to, that I want to kind of go over with you just to make sure that you're closer. Now you can use this or not use this, but this is going to be a nice segue into the next piece after we get back from the break, which is we're going to be creating a top-down scroller. Is it about this? Can't help you. Right now I'm teaching. Sorry. Okay, so as we go on, and if you remember what we did, we kind of put together this slot machine demo last week. So let's go there. So join me on that slot machine demo. Now you may have your own slot machine, that's fine, but I want you to join me on the slot machine demo that I have up from last week. If you already are using it, that's fine. Let me just pull up and see what I got in terms of my code. And there's some really ugly code here, as you can see, right? I got some real ugly code I got going on here. I've got my fruit tally and everything else. Some things work okay, like my spin button in and out and all that kind of stuff, but I got to create more than one button. And if I run this thing right now the way it is, just like I showed you guys last time, I should see this slot machine. When I click it, I got these things, but I got no other buttons. And I want to have this same behavior for every one of my buttons. And I don't want to create multiple lines of event listeners, right? That makes no sense to me. So of course, what we're talking about is creating a class, right? A button class. And we haven't done that yet. How do I create a button class, as an example, with TypeScript? And this is the power of TypeScript, right? So there's a couple things to do here. One of the things I want you to learn right away is I want you to think about things in terms of modules. So if I'm going to create a module, how do I do modules in TypeScript, first of all? It starts in my mind, if I was going to work like a C# developer or a Java developer or any other kind of developer, I always want to separate my classes out, right? It doesn't make any sense for me to have my classes in the same file, right? That's kind of, we can do it one time and then never again, okay? So I want you to think of that. That's one thing I want to do. Now you see some areas here in my file, these variable statements up here. What are these variables in terms of scope? What scope do these variables have right now? Global, right? They're in the global scope, the global namespace, if you will, right? And this is okay, but that means above these variables, I can keep typing whatever I want, right? So I can kind of do one of these, right? Give it some space and kind of go above here and start typing my class. And this is the first and last time you'll see us do this, okay? Well, let's just say. So I'm going to start typing my class. I'm going to call it, my class, of course, is going to be button with a capital B, right? And when I declare a class with TypeScript, as an example, what I want to do is the class declaration itself has to have capitals, right? That's the convention we're going to use. And then I'm going to use two curly braces to kind of sketch out the namespace for the class. So this is my namespace inside here, right? Now, I know when I create my button class, I want it to, and this is going back to what we're doing here in Java in the other class, right? Here we're talking about classes, And one thing is, if I was to do this, I would want to extend, right? I want to extend the button, a class that already exists. You know, that would be the best case scenario. But we haven't done regular object-oriented programming yet, so I'm not going to show you that piece yet, right? The first piece we got to do is got to figure out, my button has got to have a couple things. It's got to have the actual bitmap, right? When I call button, and it needs, and the button itself has to have some kind of image. So there's an image attached to the button, like the background for the button itself, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, it depends on the type of button. Some buttons will have labels, right? Like a custom label button that you make. So I can have a generic background, and I can put a kind of a label on top of it, right? In this case, because I'm using it for the slot machine, it's going to be a slot machine button, which means it's going to have its own bitmap. So for now, all I need is a bitmap object, okay? So in order for me to create instance variables for my classes in TypeScript and in JavaScript, it's a little bit different than other languages. Here, instead of me using the var keyword, because I'm inside of a class, I don't need to do that in TypeScript. Okay, so all I have to do here, so this is the syntax, if you will. I got to think about my button image. I just call this thing image, right? Now image, if you notice, take a look. It says it's already a property of the generic namespace. So this is bad. I don't want to do this, right? I probably want to call this something like button image. So let's do that. So button image with an I, right? That's a unique identifier, right? Then I want to kind of create what type of object I'm creating. So it's going to be a createjs.bitmap object. Now I'm just sketching it out here. So when I do this, all I'm doing is I'm creating a reference to the object that I'm creating. All right. So I haven't actually instantiated a new object of type of createjs bitmap. I haven't done that. I'm just creating a reference to it here. Right. I'm typing it. Okay, that's the first thing I need to do. What else do I need for my objects? That's about it, really. Just my object, right? And then something to click on and a couple of methods. Yeah. Yeah. Don't worry. I'm going to put all that in here. I'm going to put a couple of methods in here, and there's going to be the hover method and the other method that are going to be in here. I don't want the click method necessarily to be in here because the click will be different every time, right? But the hover method and the hover over and hover out, I want those two methods in here.
Also, could you not pass your bitmap as a parameter to the button class?
I could. I like your thinking, right? I could do that. So I could pass in the type of image, right? So that's something that's going to come into my constructor, right? So I need a constructor, and that's the next piece. So this, I'm just going to use some commenting here. My button, I'm just going to go and comment it, and I'm going to say, I'll call this instance variables or fields or whatever you want to call them. They're also called fields. Here's my instance variables here. And this might look very familiar to you because we do the same thing in Java and other languages, right? And now here's the other question. Is my button image public or private? Come on, guys. We're working with people over here. Private or public for my button image? Should I have access to the image itself outside of no? So it's got to be private. And I can do that because I'm using TypeScript, right? Okay, that's the first thing. So I got a private button image, which means by convention I should use an underscore. All right, so these are my private instance variables. All right, I don't have to use an underscore. I'm just using it because that's the way I'm kind of declaring my class. This is where the two courses that you're doing, 1011 and COMP2068 link. Okay. Okay, now I need a constructor. Now in TypeScript, or in what we're looking at is for ECMAScript 6 Harmony, the new version of ECMAScript that's going to be coming out at some point soon. We call it a constructor. There are some other recommendations for ECMAScript 6 that are going to make it so it's called init, an initializer. Initializers and constructor, same idea. Swift has gone the way. If you're a Swift programmer, they're also making recommendations to ECMAScript 6. They're using init as their constructor keyword. For us here in TypeScript, it's constructor. And inside the constructor, it's just like a regular method. So you have to declare it. Again, there's no var keyword. All we're doing here is we're just using the keyword constructor. And in here, we're going to take in the variable that we're looking at, which is going to be a text variable of the path for our bitmap. That's what we're going to take in. So really, I want my a path. That's what we're going to take in. And it's of type string, of course, right? So here's string. And that's what's incoming into my constructor, right? Okay, cool. So I've got that. And in my constructor, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be declaring this button image. I'm going to create this new button image. Okay, so here we are. So I'm going to say this dot underscore button image. This looks very familiar to you. If you know Java, you know TypeScript, right? Or even C#. This dot underscore button image is equal to new, right? Create.js dot bitmap. All right, and of course, what am I going to pass in there? It's going to be the image or URL that I'm passing in here into my bitmap. So of course, I'm going to pass in what? String. This string image, this path variable that I'm getting in here, right? Now, if you notice what it says, hey, I got a problem here because it says I've got 3 overloads, and I'm looking to put in, it does not match any signature of like my call target because type string is missing property width from the HTML element, right? Now that's probably because if I use a lowercase s, right, as an example, it won't give me that issue. There's 2 different types of strings. I use the uppercase as a mistake. Lowercase is what you want to use, and then that issue goes away. Because string, capital S, is a complex variable and requires other things. Okay, let's leave that alone. So this is the first thing. So I've created, when I instantiate my button class, my button object, what is it doing? It's going to fire or trigger the constructor object, right? The constructor method. It's going to trigger that constructor method. When the constructor method is triggered, my button image is going to be instantiated. I'm going to create this new button. All right, that's the first thing. Okay, cool. That's the one thing I want to do for sure, right? And then, of course, I want to, with this button image, I want to create my new methods, right? So I'm going to create some listeners right here inside of my constructor, right? So I'm going to say, well, this dot underscore button image dot add event listener. Again, I haven't added it to anything yet. I haven't added my button, to my canvas. Now there's two ways I can do this. I can create my button, add it to my canvas afterwards. I could do that, or my container, whatever it is, or I can do it here. Yes.
Can we pass X and Y coordinates?
I could. I haven't gotten there. That's a good thing to do because otherwise you'd have to pass it afterwards, right? But remember, my button it's its own image. What am I really passing? I'm not going to use my button because my button itself right now has no X and Y coordinates. There is no X and Y for the button. I'd have to create my own X and Y coordinates, right? Remember, I'm making a whole new class. The only thing, I'm not extending the button class. I'm not extending the bitmap class yet. I don't want to go there with you yet. I want to just create a new class called button, and it has a bitmap inside of it as an object, right? So if I want to, I could put in something like X and Y coordinates. Like for example, up here in private, I could say, actually maybe these would be public, right? Because I want to be accessing them outside. So I can say public X, right? And my public X coordinate is going to be of type number, right? And of course, I'm going to have a public Y, which is also of type number. And I like your thinking, right? So there's 2 ways we can do this. I can create getters and setters for this, which is another thing you can do, right? Or instead of getters and setters, I can actually initially pass them into my my constructor for setting. So I can say, here's an X value, which is a number, and there's a Y number, which is a number. And you know what? I'm going to set these things. I'm going to set the value of these things here. So I'm going to say this dot underscore X, where X is equal to X, and this dot Y is equal to Y. But again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But that's fine. I like your thinking. Let's leave that in. Let's create this thing together, right? So now I have X and Y coordinates that are going to be kept here locally. I haven't done anything with them here. And here's the other question. Do I really need these values, right? Well, yeah, the answer would be yes. But what I really want to do is I want these values, if I want to move the button around later on, I want to be able to change them. So that's why I made these public X and Y values. But what I really need here instead of X and Y values, if I want to make it the way you're thinking, is setters and getters and setters, right? So again, if I was going to do that, I can right-click And let me just stop functioning with this thing. I can right click, and if I go refactor, the only thing I can do right now is go rename. I can't create a getter and setter. And if you don't know any of this stuff, by the way, you don't know how to create a getter and setter in TypeScript, of course, and this is what I'm going to ask you to do, is go to the typescriptlang.org API documentation, right? Because it's just another API for now, a syntactic sugar, if you will. And if you go to Learn and you go to Handbook, right, then it tells you everything you need to know how to create classes, mix-ins, if there are interfaces. Here's some basic types. How do I do classes? There's static properties, private and public modifiers, everything that's here, right? And also, they also do things like type inference and compatibility, and on the whole 9 yards is really here. So I need a getter and setter, and there's 2 ways I can kind of do this thing, right? Because I'm not going to talk about other language specifications right now at this particular moment, right? So the one thing I can do, instead of this, I make these private x and y values, right? And I have a set x and set y method that I declare. So let's do that first. So first, instead of public, we'll make these private, because that makes more sense, right? So here we are, private x and private y, and of course, I'm going to refactor these things. I'm just going to rename them down here, just makes it easier. And what I want to do is the x and y value is something that I want to set initially when I create my constructor. That's the first thing I want to do. But I also want to have methods, and let's just create our first method. Our first one is going to be like this. And when we do methods, there's no vars again or whatever. We don't use function, the keyword function, because it's a method. We use just the method name, and if it's public or private. So this is a public method that we're going to declare. We can declare if it returns something, but for now it's going to return nothing. And we're going to call this setX, right? SetX. And the method is going to pass in an x value, which is a number, right? And curly braces for the method. So the methods are declared like this, with no variable, no function. You don't have to use the function keyword, right? So here's setX, and when we set the x value, because all we want to do is set x, we can also create a getX method. That would be the getter, right? And let's do that. So we're going to say this dot underscore x, right, is equal to x. That's your setter. Okay, and the same thing goes with our setter for the y. This is pretty straightforward, but you'll see the beauty in this in a second. So public set y. Again, we're taking in a y value, and we're setting the y down here, right? Set y is equal to y. And you know what the beauty thing is? Once we've declared these setters down here, this is the beautiful thing, right? They're public. Well, guess what? Over here, I can use them up here too. Even though they're down here inside my, in the body of my class, I can still use them in the constructor. So let's call them instead of doing this directly, like this. So I can say this dot set x is x, right? And I can say this dot set y, because I've just created my setters. This dot set y, right, of y. And then, of course, I'm getting these x and y values and using my setters instead of directly accessing these properties. So these are private properties. These are my 2 setters. Let's create my getters now. Of course, they'd be before my setters. This is the way I would normally do it. And these are public as well. Public get x, right? Get x, where x is the value. This one would have a return of type number. This is how you do a return type in TypeScript, right? If the reason why it's giving me an underline is because I need a return statement, and I'm going to return this dot underscore x, right? So that's my getter, right? And I'll do the same thing with my y value, right? So here's my y value. So get x and get y. And by the way, you're going to see how this simplifies when we do some we extend our class. Okay, so I got my getters and my setters. It means if I want to get the y value or the x value, I can do that. Okay, this is cool. I've done this first piece, right? These are my getters and setters. So these are public properties. Right, here's my public properties in here. But what I want to do in here, right, is I want to assign my x and y values to my bitmap. Because that's the thing that's actually moving. Not my actual, my class. Doesn't mean anything to my class. It really's got to translate into my bitmap. So whenever I do this, as soon as I create my object, I'm going to say this dot underscore button image dot x, right? Because it has an x and y value, is equal to this dot underscore x. And this dot underscore button image dot y is equal to this dot underscore y. Okay? Are we understanding what we're doing? Now look at what it's creating for us on the right-hand side here. This is our class definition, but what it's doing here is actually creating a new closure. That's what this is called, a closure. And a closure looks just like this. We have an anonymous function at the top, right? And we have this syntax at the bottom, right? So this closure is a namespace of its own, and it's called button, right? So I've created a new namespace. And the new namespace is right here. It's before everything else. That's why I've put it in there, right? Again, this is the first and last time we're going to do this, right? Okay, cool. So I got my getters and setters, and now I need my my methods, my other methods. Well, this is I've started doing my add event listener over here. Let's continue, right? Okay, sorry. Before we do that, let's go back. Yes.
That X and Y setting is only set up the X and Y of the image itself within the button class.
Correct. But that's all it's going to do, right? Yeah, for now. Because we can't. The button class itself only has an image right now, and it's going to have two methods.
It's not positional on the stage.
There's nothing, yeah. There's nothing I haven't added to the stage yet. So my question to you is, there's a decision we make. Do we add the button image when we instantiate a new button, do we automatically add it to a container, right? Or do we add it to the container after? So we instantiate the button image, and then we do whatever the game.addChild button. We do that. Or would you rather do it so that, and this is the question I have for you, right? It's your design decision for the class. Or do we do it like this? My button is equal to new button, and when I do that, it automatically adds it to the container we choose to put it to. In other words, do I pass the container object inside of my constructor? Right? I mean, it's one way we can do it, right? We can say, I can create a new private instance variable that's called container, right? I can make a reference to the constructor and then pass in the container to the constructor automatically. So it adds the button to the container when it's instantiated, right? Automatically, right? So as soon as you instantiate the button, you don't have to do that extra line of code, is what I'm saying. You don't have to sit there and go, my button.addChild or my game.addChild button. You don't have to do that anymore. So two design decisions. Which way you want to go? You tell me. Do you even understand what I'm saying? So there's two ways you can do this. You can add things to the button, right? Add the button to the container, right? Automatically when my button is instantiated, right? Or do I want to do that separately outside of my button class? Okay, separately is the decision. So we're not going to do it here. So when I add my x and y coordinates here, I haven't really done anything. I'm positioning the button. That's going to be, these are the properties of my image class. And when I do my instantiation, when I say add child button, I can't do add child button anymore. I've got to go and say game.addChildButton.image, because that's what I'm adding to the stage. I'm not adding the actual button. The button governs the image plus any other methods that are attached to the button. That's what it's doing. That's what the button class is doing for us at this stage, right? So if I'm just keeping that in mind, because the button means nothing. The button doesn't have it has an image property, but it isn't an image, right? Right? That's what it is right now, because we're not inheriting from bitmap. It's just that, right? So think of that now. Okay, so if we go through this is the next piece. We need some kind of, here are my event handlers. We need those. But we need to make our event listeners happen up here. So we're going to add an event listener of type mouse over, right? And we're going to call this a again, it's going to be an internal event handler. We're going to call it this dot, and we haven't kind of described these yet. Underscore button over, right? It's an internal method, right? It's a private method that we're going to use, right? And we're going to do the same thing for the out, button out, right? Add event listener. I'm going to say mouse out, right? And this dot underscore button out. So there's two over and out. And of course, I already have this code. It's just down here, right? So instead of me doing this spin button out, I'm just going to copy it for now because I'm going to use these two methods, right? So here's my copy. I'm going to go back up here into my class that I'm creating. I've just left a lot of space here for a second. I'm going to put these in my class, but I don't need the function keyword because these are methods. And they're not going to be called spin button out. I'm just going to use this button out. And same thing with button over. You're going to see what I'm going to do in a second. I'm going to kind of pull this out for a second. All right, let me just re-spin this, for example, just to make sure it's all aligned properly. It's called this button over and this button out, right? Button out and button over. And of course, I'm going to make these private because I don't need for them to be exposed to the outside world. So they're private methods, right? And they're going to return nothing because they're going to return nothing. I'm going to put void at the end. This is my return type up here. By the way, Swift does the same kind of thing, but instead of the colon after Swift, if you're going to do that, it has a dash arrow. It's an arrow return type. And of course, I'm not doing spin button alpha and the spin button alpha. I'm not changing these inside here. I'm changing, of course, this dot underscore button image, my image alpha, right? And the same thing goes here. This dot underscore image alpha, button image alpha. I'll be okay. There we go. So those are the only things I'm doing with these two methods. Here's two methods, right? They're two private methods. And all these things are doing, they're not returning anything, right? All they're doing is they're changing the alpha. These are event handlers, right? And by the way, if I want to, I can pass in, they do receive an event, right, of type mouse event. So if I want to, I can kind of go event of create.js, and then mouse event. That's the type of event that it returns. This looks very, very Flash-like now, right, or ActionScript-like. Now again, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to use these event variables, but I want to show you that this would be how it would, I'll be okay. This would be how it would normally look if you wanted to use the event variables that come through, because once you declare these things as handlers, they do receive this event variable, whether you use it or not. Okay, so I've declared a couple of handlers. I made them up here, this button over and this button out. Did I create? I made them wrong, of course. button out and button over. There we go. That takes away my errors. Okay, and if I save it, let's see what I have here in my JavaScript. This is what the JavaScript side would look like. And if you notice on the JavaScript side, there is no typing, right? It just declares some prototypes from my methods. These are prototypes that belong to my methods. This is what it would look like. And I have my event handlers, my public properties, and everything else that's here inside my constructor. Okay, so that's why we use TypeScript, because TypeScript makes sense, right? When you look at JavaScript, if you haven't seen JavaScript notation before, you're like, whoa, what does that mean, right? Okay, so we've created a class. Let's see if we can instantiate the button class for our spin button as opposed to using our regular image, bitmap image. Yes? Is there anything we're missing?
Yes.
What? Tell me.
You're not adding the
Well, I am. I'm doing it here. So the image is incoming from the constructor. Are we doing it here, like I said? Or are we doing it inside the? Yeah, sorry, buddy. I know. If I was going to extend it, it'd be easier. But I'm not doing an extending right now, right? So let's go back down to here. So here's my spin button out and over. I don't need these anymore, right? Because if I create my new button, in fact, let's do it here. So here's my game variables, right? And I've got a the spin result, and over here is these game objects. I've got something called game background spin button. Spin button. But instead of making this create.js bitmap, I don't do that anymore. I'm going to make it of type create.js, of type button. That's my new class, right? Okay, once I do that, of course, I've got a bunch of errors, right? Here's the primary one. I've got my alpha. I don't need these handlers anymore, so I'm just going to get, for now, I'm going to put them in stasis. So I'm going to kind of just do one of these. And I'm just going to take all this stuff and cut it and kind of paste it inside there. So they're in stasis right now. So they don't exist. And I'll put these down here. Well, all this stuff can disappear. I'm just going to do this. Well, my button, I've got to declare my button, right? So spin button is equal to new, instead of new create.js bitmap, it's going to be new button, right? And I need to pass in there the x and y coordinates. Well, I knew I have those, which is 323 and 376. I know that's part of it. And I don't need to do this anymore because that's gone. And I'm going to add child, but I'm not going to add child my spin button because I can't. I need to add child my spin button dot image. And this is where I have an issue because I don't have a public property. The only thing I have is a getter and a setter, right? So I need to get another public property called get image, right? Get image, which is going to return my image because I don't want it to be exposed, right? So let's go back up to my class, way up here. And I've got my public getters and setters. I'm going to make one more, right? And we're going to call this, it's going to be of type public. We're going to call it get image, right? And it's going to return my bitmap image. It's got to return of type bitmap, right? So it's going to be of type create.js.bitmap. That's the type it's going to return. Oops, not bip. And of course, when I do that, it's going to give me an error until I return. I have a return statement, which is really going to do, I'm going to return, this is where it gets funky, this dot underscore bitmap image. Yeah? Because now what I'm doing is I'm taking this object I've just created called bitmap image or button image, and I'm returning it out back into the main flow. So if I save it, we're going to see what it looks like in a second. I'm going to go back down here where I have all my errors, right? And now I can't just add my spin button. I've got to do a spin button dot get image. Oops. And that's what I'm returning. So that's what's going to come out, right? Which works. So now it's a bitmap that I'm adding in, and I don't need all this. I only need my event listener for my reels, right? So spin button event listener, it says, whoa, I can't add a spin button to my event listener, right? I'm not adding it to my event listener. What am I adding it to? My image. So I got to do the same thing. I'm going to return back, right? I'm going to use my get image control, if I can do this. And I'm going to add an event listener to that. How cumbersome, huh? I know, it's ugly, but it works, right? Let's see if it works. Okay, so this is all done. I've instantiated my button. It's I've typed button. I've added my image in there because I've got to use the image of my button to add to my game container. And I've created this new event listener called click that spins my reels. Okay? If everything is good and I've done everything correctly, then all this should work. Let's run this thing and see if I get an error. Okay, so I still got my hover going on, right? Actually, let's refresh. That's always a trick. You think it works, but it doesn't. See, this isn't working. And here's why. Let's take a look at my JavaScript console. It says, cannot set property alpha of undefined. Right? I'm trying to set alpha. So it's actually trying to do something. Here I am. I'm trying to do this thing, and it's trying to do it, right? So it actually is responding. And if I click onto it, this works. The clicking works because I just added this locally, right? But when I try and do this up here, right, inside my class, I'm trying to make these two event handlers button out and button over. And I'm using this button image.alpha, right? Even though I'm accessing this here, this button image.alpha for 1 and 0.5. Why isn't this, what's this pointing to in this context over here, inside this code block? Here, I'll do our friend here, Blink. Go.
Button object that's looking for the mouse, highlighting the button object on the image itself.
So this is a problem. That's what I'm trying to say. And now that I've got this event that's coming in here, but the event tells me what the target is, right? That's where I have to look at. I'm not going to update my my button image because this makes no sense in this context. I don't have access, even though my button image is part of my class. Here in this little namespace, I don't have access to my button, this. I have to either pass it in to my event handler, that's one, or I have to use my event variable to do that. So if this is true, and if this is a mouse event, and this is what I did this, I should be able to do something like this. Event dot, and I have a bunch of different kinds of options. For example, current target, right? I can say event dot current target, right? And that's what I want this thing to change my alpha. But the problem is, because my current target, let me just show you this now. If I was to say something like event.currentTarget.alpha, right, is equal to 1, right? Well, yeah, I could try and do this, right? But the problem is it may or may not work because I can't get code hinting on current target because current target has there's no context for current target. So there's two things to do. I could cast current target as a type bitmap. That's one thing I could do, which would save my bum in some ways. For now, let's just leave it like someone to just comment this out. I'm going to put this back over here. And let's see if this works. Because see, we've been using this, but this means something different in this context. Okay, let's refresh this thing now and go back. Let's see if it doesn't work now. Whoa, wait a minute. Let's try it now. How come? How come? Well, I'm trying, but current target doesn't mean anything. And that's the issue, right? I can click spin, it'll spin like it always did, because that was outside of my context. That's out here. That's out here inside my main body of my global scope, right? So I'm not going to save myself anything at this point to create this methodology here. How about, here's another option. Instead of creating my methods here, right, these two methods here inside event handlers, could I save myself, my question to you, and do them as anonymous functions right here? And would that solve the issue for now?
Might work for some reason.
Mine didn't.
You didn't switch your
Huh?
Yeah, your alpha is 1.
Oh, let's try it. Maybe I made a mistake. Yeah. But this is I would try the other way too. I'll show you the other way as well. Either way. I hope it worked for me too, because I was expecting. I was like, that's interesting. Yeah. See. Oh, there we go. Okay. There's a bit of a delay. How come that happens? How come it's happening like this? Well, it's reversed, right? Because I reversed the way it worked. It should be my button over should be 0.5, right? And my button out should be 1. That's how I just reversed them. That's why it was happening that way. So I made a mistake. But now it's giving the right result, right? I'm using the target to do it. But let's say you couldn't figure this out. You don't know what the hell I did to do. Why am I using event target? And how come this isn't working? Because this points to my object and all that kind of stuff. And that makes sense, Tom. It should work. That's what you said to us before. This should point to the right object. How come? Well, again, we're looking at the context, which is between these two braces. And when you have an event listener, and this is the key, guys, when I create an event listener, anything that's inside that, the context of those two braces is a different this. And unfortunately, this dot underscore button image does not exist in this context. So I'm trying to add alpha to an undefined property. Because in this context, between these two braces, right, because it's an event listener or event handler, it's a new namespace It's a totally new namespace. It does not inherit from the previous namespace at all. So keep that in mind, please. Now, if this is a regular method, I could pass it in as a method parameter. I can't do that. The only thing that it can accept, again, is this event variable, right? With our standard event listener. Okay? So this works. So I can get rid of my commenting. The other way you could do this, of course, is to create an anonymous function. I'm going to show you that really quickly. I'm going to comment my stuff out here for a second and just create an anonymous method. So here we go. I'm just going to go over here and I'm just going to put all this in stasis. I know it works now, but I'm just going to kind of plop this all in here. And I want to do it up here, right? So if you notice, instead of this dot button over, I'm going to kind of put it in here and go function. Here's my anonymous function call, right? And inside here, right, I would have to do the same thing. I would have to pass in an event, right, of type mouse event. And inside this context here, I would say that this button image dot alpha would be this underscore button image. If you notice how it's not giving me a code hinting, because I've got my same issue inside this new namespace. I have no access to this button. If it's not giving me code hinting, I can't find it, which means it doesn't exist. Right? So I could do it in here too. I don't have to do this here. I would still have to do this same trick that I did up here, right? I'm just going to put it in here. I still have to do this, right? But I could do it here in this little space up here instead of creating its own method. So this is called an anonymous function. You're going to see this is a very, and unfortunately for us here, the property alpha does not exist in type event target, right? Here it works though. So this is why I don't do it up here. I did it down there for that particular reason. But you could still do this. Even though it's giving me this error, it would still work. You would actually still fire. Yeah.
Is it maybe because it just says event most event, not create JS?
Oh yeah, that'd be good. That would probably be the right reason. Yeah. And that's the reason, right? But again, you could do it here in this context as opposed to with an anonymous function, as opposed to a named function like down here. Now, I prefer the named function methodology only because it makes sense. But if you're the type of person that's a minimalist, this is also fine. So if you did this, and you do this for the button out, you could do that. And in fact, we can mix and match if we really want to, right? We can use one methodology for one type, and for the other type, we could do the other methodology, and both would work. It wouldn't error out. Actually, I just did the wrong one, didn't I? Here, let's just do it this way. Okay, so there's two different versions you can use. Here's the one way of doing it. I'm just going to give some space here, some white space so you can see it. This is the one way to do I call this like almost like a pregnant handler, if you will, right? You've got a callback function, which is this anonymous method call, right? With a different type of notation, right? To me, this looks cleaner. The second method, right? The second way of doing it. So both work. Both would give you the same result, but I prefer the second way, right? So let's get rid of this. Let's put it back the way it was. I'm just going to undo all these changes. I'm not going to stop you though. If you're really intent on doing it one way or the other, both ways are syntactically correct. And from a best practices perspective, I can't really tell you which one is kind of a best practice more than the other because they're equally used, across the board in terms of how we do JavaScript. And remember, even though we're doing TypeScript, it's just JavaScript on wheels, if you will. Okay, this is cool. We've done this class button, and let me just save this and run this. In fact, if anything, I'll go to my solution, and I will stop, and I'm going to go into Home, Changes, and I'm going to say, I'm also going to add in my buttons. So I'm going to add all this. I'm going to say, added button class. Okay? Okay, this is cool that I've added the button class, but it's inside my code. And you know, my code's getting pretty long and lanky and ugly, and I really don't like it inside my code. I think it's darn ugly, if you ask me, right? So the best thing for me to do is extract this class and put it in its own module, all right? So this is where the key thing is, guys. So I want you to watch this piece if you haven't watched anything yet. For those people who want to do this, right? By the way, for the people who are still writing the exam, you've got 15 minutes and counting. Remember, at 15, at 1:45, we're going to shut it down. Okay. I want to put this in its own module, right? So it doesn't disrupt my main body, right? How do I do that? Well, first, I got to go into Solution Explorer and create a new place for it. So I've got a scripts file, right? And in my scripts file, what I want to do is I want to right-click and say Add, and I want to create a new folder of game objects, if you will, right? Now, there's different ways I can do this. I can call this, you know, whatever my scope is going to be, or my namespace that I want to create. I usually try and create a folder for this. I'm just going to call this Objects. All right? So Objects. And inside my folder, I'm going to add in my first new object, and it's going to be called Button with a capital B. It's going to be a TypeScript file. Here's my new file, Button. My button file is empty, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my new button class I just created. Here it is. Here's my class Button. And I'm going to grab this whole thing and cut it out, right? I'm going to go into my new button file and paste it in. So here it is. Here's my button class. Now, in order for me to have access to it, and by the way, I'm just going to get rid of all this, right? For a second. In order for me to have access to it, I need a couple things. The first thing I need to do is in my index.html page, here's my index.html page, I need to create my button, and it's got to be accessible above my game.js file, right? So I need to take my button class and drag and drop it above my file. And of course, it's the JS version, right, that I'm getting. So that's the first thing I got to do. It's part of I got to add my script into my index.html, okay? The next thing I got to do for my button class is I need to create a module, an export around it, right? So I got to say module, right? And I got to name the module. What's the module called? Well, it's objects. That's what my module is called, objects. And I've got to kind of surround them with these curly braces. This is my new namespace. It's called objects, right? And I got to take my button class now. So I'm going to highlight the whole thing. And I'm going to move this inside of this namespace. So here it is. It's inside my namespace of module objects, right? Now, it's still not visible to my main game class until I use my export keyword. So I'm going to say export class button. And once I've done that now, there's one more step. I've got to go into my game file, and I've got to create a reference to this thing. What I'm going to do, of course, is drag and drop my button into my my game.ts file. Okay, now that I've done this, if you notice, I'm getting an underline, a red squiggly, right? Because what should it really be now? It's not button anymore. It's my new namespace. Come on, who can guess this out? It's kind of easy. Objects.button, right? Because it's in my new namespace, right? So nice and easy. So I'm going to say objects, see if it finds it. Here it is. Objects dot, if I can actually type, button, right? And which means every instance of this thing that I refer to, it has to be referred to the same way, which is objects.button, right? And now I have two modules, right? One with my main game class, and the other one that's here in my button class. And when I run this thing now, just to make sure it tests out, right? Let me just refresh. And I have my button working, and I spin, and it works. And let me just check for errors. That's another thing that I like to check. And there's no errors. It just does my output. So what have we learned today, right? Again, I've done a couple things. I've created a class in TypeScript, all right? And I've called it my button class. Right, here it is. And my button class is inside this module. And the module is a container. It's a namespace container. And I can have as many of these modules in my app as I'd like, right? I can have 20 modules, 100 modules, 1,000 modules, and they're all linked to my main index.html. In fact, my index.html is the glue that pieces all these modules together, and they will appear in the order that I declare them. So in my index.html, it's very important to put the stuff that I want to have access to at the top before my game class. So here, I would have to put something like this. I would have to say, let's make some comments. These are my game scripts. Right, here's my game scripts. I'm going to have more than one. Right now I only have one. And there's my game file itself. So my game scripts would all be in here. I have made more than one. Well, this is cool. Now that I've got my button, right, as long as I have no different images for my buttons, and I do, for example, I have my bet button, I have my button 1, and all that kind of stuff, well, that means that I could reuse. Is that your hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me.
I was just wondering, is the reason that we don't have to reference the other libraries because they're in the lib folder?
Reference them in what way?
Like create a reference path in the game.txt.
Oh yeah, they're there, and the fact they also have their own namespace, right? They've already done that stuff for you. Okay. It's inside there. The stuff they've put into the libraries cover all that for you.
Oh, okay.
We could do that too. We're not, right? Don't worry about that right now. So then we're making this reference path because that way we want a reference path to our new class. Well, now that we have a reference path, well, I can go down in here, right? Inside, this is where the powerful stuff goes on, right down here. I can start inside my create UI, right? I can do my new stuff, the things that I want to do. Like, for example, I'm going to do, instead of my spin button, I'm going to do my reset button. Let's do that next. So reset button, right? And I'll just do this really quickly. I need a reference to my reset button at the top, so we'll call it, instead of spin button, I'll make it a reset button, var reset button, objects of type objects.button, the same one we just created, right? And I'm going to go back down to my where I'm going to create this thing. I'm going to say reset button, right, is equal to new objects, because we have our objects.button. Just pull this up so you guys can see this thing. And of course, what are we passing in there? We're passing in the other path, assets, images, reset button, .ping. And we need the location of that, which I have, if you remember, in my my downloads. I have a Slotmachine assets, right? This is where I have it. And I believe this is the right one. And inside here, I have a bitmap coordinates file that I've kept. One day when it decides to open, here it is. Betmax, Bet1, reset button, and power button, right? And I know that if I'm right, is that right? No, it's not that. It's not the right one. Sorry, you guys had first crack at this, not the other class. Let's go back out. Guys, it's time to pack it up. The guys who are ready, it's 1:40. Start packing things up, please, for those people who are doing your exam. And I want you to start packing it up, packaging it up, because at 1:45 I'm shutting this thing down. Right? So here's my coordinates. My start x and start y is 38 and 380. So this is what I'm going to put in here: 38 and 380. Right? And then I'm going to go game.addChild the same kind of way I did it before, but instead of spin button, it's going to be reset button dot get image, right? And that's going to add my reset button in there. And of course, if I want to create its own listener, I could say reset button dot get image dot add event listener of type click. And you know, we're going to do an anonymous function just for our demonstration purposes right here, where we're going to do a function in here that does a console out. reset clicked. So we know it's working, right? Okay, so we create a new button. Let's see if it works. I want to see if this thing kind of pops up. And does it have all the stuff that I want from a reset button? Like, for example, does my hover work? Yes, it does. I don't have to program that in. It's already done. My spin button works, and when I click reset, well, then I should have in my JavaScript console, I should be able to say my reset's clicked. If I click my spin button, that still works. So now everything works. So I created one class, and now I can use it for both buttons. Okay? Really powerful stuff, and that's why we use TypeScript instead of just JavaScript. Okay, that's it for me. I'm just going to update the files. But for now, this is the end of this movie.